their heart has changed. If you notice these 3 signs, welcome to Live Stoic, Live Strong. Have you ever felt completely alone while sitting next to the very person you once believed would always understand you? You're in the same room, breathing the same air, but the connection? It's not just fading, it's vanishing quietly. What if the true end of love doesn't come with yelling or slamming doors, but with silence so soft, you almost miss it? Have you ever stood near someone you love with all your heart and felt like you were invisible? Like your body is physically there, but your soul has nowhere left to land? You're not fighting. You're not breaking dishes or yelling across rooms. You're simply coexisting. Breathing the same air, walking the same routines, but feeling as if a thick wall of glass separates you, close enough to see them, but too far to touch what used to be between you. The warmth that once lived in casual glances and quiet gestures has turned cold. The shared laughter that used to echo in the room now feels like a distant sound you can barely remember. You wait. You hope. You search for a sign, any sign, that what's slipping away can still be caught. But all that greets you is stillness. Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic thinker, once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." On the surface, it reads like a simple reminder. But in moments like this, when someone begins to withdraw and the relationship begins to fray, that quote becomes a lighthouse in the fog. Because what breaks us is not just their fading presence. It's our refusal to face the quiet truth. Things have already begun to change. We cling. We hold on to the version of love that once was. The laughter, the late-night talks, the way your hand found theirs without thinking. We replay the highlight reel in our minds, convincing ourselves that with enough effort, we can rewind time. But today, I want to explore something most people don't dare admit. When love begins to leave, it doesn't leave in anger. It leaves in whispers. And if you listen closely, those whispers come in 3 distinct, undeniable forms. They're not explosive. They're not cruel. But they're real. If your heart is open enough, and your eyes willing to see it, let me take you into a story. Not a tragic one, but an honest one. David met Margaret in 1994 at a modest little church potluck tucked into a quiet neighborhood in Atlanta. It was a Sunday afternoon, sunlight spilling softly through the stained glass windows. She wore a pale blue dress, the kind that made her seem like she belonged in a different era. David stood by the snack table with a plate of warm bread rolls, too shy to approach her directly, but unable to look away. 2 years later, they married, bought a small home on a tree-lined street, raised 2 boys with grass-stained knees and bedtime stories, adopted a golden retriever named Max, who snored louder than David ever could. Their life, like so many others, wasn't perfect, but it was built on rhythm, on teamwork, on moments shared without needing to speak. They faced hardship together. Job loss, aging parents, the usual trials that shape a life. But they faced them as one. Until, somewhere around year 30, something began to change. There was no dramatic fight. No betrayal. No loud breaking point. Just quiet. Margaret started saying less. David began to fill the silence with routine. They still shared a bed, still went to church, still smiled in family photos. But behind closed doors, the energy shifted. And slowly, quietly, they began to drift. This is the quiet heartbreak of long-term love. It doesn't always shatter with a bang. Often, it erodes like stone underwater, gradually, invisibly. Until one day, you wake up beside someone and realize you've become strangers in familiar skin. Stoic philosophy teaches us not to panic, but to observe, to focus on what's still within reach. And in relationships, sometimes the only thing we can truly control is our awareness. The courage to notice the fading before it's too late. That's where the first sign appears. Gentle, subtle, but powerful. Silent emotional withdrawal. Margaret still cooked dinner, still ironed his shirts, still sat next to David during Sunday service. On the outside, she looked present, but inside, she was gone. Her laughter didn't quite reach her eyes. Her nods to David's stories felt like habits, not engagement. The house was clean. The routines were maintained. But the heart of it? The heartbeat? It was fading. David couldn't name it at first. It wasn't obvious. But over time, he realized he was no longer being seen, only observed. No longer being loved, only tolerated. And that's where we begin. With silence. With the kind of distance that hides behind everyday actions. In the next part, we'll go deeper into this first sign and what it really means when love starts to grow quiet. Previous signs can be easy to ignore until they become impossible to unfeel. The silence between David and Margaret had deepened, not suddenly, but gradually, like fog rolling into a familiar valley. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but something had shifted. Imagine entering your living room one day and noticing that the furniture had been moved, not by feet, but by inches. So slowly, so subtly, that you question whether it ever felt different at all. That's what had happened to their relationship. The space between them was the same, but something essential had been rearranged. Gone were the small gestures, the instinctive squeeze of her hand as they walked through their quiet neighborhood at dusk. The tender, everyday questions that once arrived like gentle music. Did you sleep okay? Or, you seem off today. Want to talk? These weren't big, showy acts of love, but they were proof that someone was paying attention. And now, they were gone. The warmth didn't vanish in a firestorm. It faded. And it was the silence that took its place. A silence so complete it echoed through every room of the house. David first truly noticed it on a Tuesday evening. There was nothing extraordinary about that day. No conflict, no crisis. He had just come home from work and was telling Margaret a light-hearted story, the kind that used to make her laugh out loud and shake her head. This time, she offered only a small smile. Not cold, not unkind, but distant, polite. She didn't look at him. She returned to slicing apples at the kitchen counter. That smile was the moment David saw it, not with his eyes, but with something deeper. He realized then that a person can be standing inches from you and still be gone. Physically present. Emotionally unreachable. This is how love fades after decades. It doesn't shatter in a single heartbreaking explosion. It doesn't announce its departure. It unravels silently, thread by thread. One unanswered feeling at a time. One meaningful gesture withheld. One moment of vulnerability left unacknowledged. There is no shouting, no betrayal, just quiet departures of the heart. And the most haunting part? Life continues. The bills still get paid. The sink still fills with dishes. The grandkids still visit on holidays, smiling in family photos. Anniversaries still appear on calendars. as though the date alone carries the weight of love. But beneath it all, the fire has gone out. The house still stands, but the warmth is gone. The center is hollow. What makes this so difficult for couples, especially those who have been together for 30 or 40 years, is that the habits of life create the illusion of connection. But love isn't measured by routines. It's felt in presence, in curiosity, in being truly seen. David had done what he believed was right. For years he was there. He showed up. He was loyal. He never betrayed Margaret, never raised his voice, never left. He provided for the family. He was consistent, steady, trustworthy. But in focusing on all the big things, he missed the small ones. He thought loyalty was enough, that showing up physically meant showing up emotionally. Maybe, in the beginning, it was. But Margaret had begun to retreat, not because she stopped loving him, and not because she wanted to leave. She was just tired. Tired of feeling invisible. Tired of her feelings echoing in an empty room. There's a unique kind of loneliness that often comes later in life. It's not about being physically alone. It's about being emotionally forgotten, sitting across from someone who no longer looks at you with curiosity, who no longer asks how your heart is doing. The heartbreak wasn't that Margaret stopped loving David. It's that she had nowhere to bring her love, no soft place to place her joy, no attentive ear to receive her quiet hurts. So she withdrew, gracefully, silently. And because she did it with grace, David didn't notice until the distance had grown too wide to ignore. Stoicism doesn't write fairy tales about love. It doesn't promise reunion or healing or second chances. It offers something else. It offers honesty. Marcus Aurelius once said, "You can stand upright even in the storm, if your mind remains unaffected." But what happens when the storm isn't loud or violent, just long, quiet, and cold? In the next part, we'll look deeper into that question as we explore the second sign that love is leaving. Not suddenly, but surely. When warmth disappears from the words we once cherished, love doesn't leave, it changes its voice. David had started noticing how Margaret would sigh before he even finished a sentence. Not an angry sigh, not even loud, but the kind that quietly communicates, "Here we go again." If he made a suggestion, she would respond as though she had already decided it was wrong. Not cruel, just distant. Icy in a way that didn't leave bruises. Only quiet bruising of the heart. And David didn't argue. He didn't snap back. He told himself maybe she was tired. Maybe she had too much on her mind. Maybe the weight of life was just heavier these days. He didn't want to invite conflict into a house that had long prided itself on peace. But deep inside, something had begun to stir. A shift. Not just in Margaret, but in David too. What used to be light-hearted teasing between partners had started to feel like judgments from above. The warmth had been replaced by cold precision. Margaret wasn't shouting. She wasn't mean, but her tone was measured, cool, and detached. Every word weighed like a stone placed carefully rather than a hand reached out, and that's what made it sting. Her words weren't designed to wound, but they no longer tried to comfort either. They didn't come from a place of affection. And that absence, that was what hurt the most. This is what happens in many long-term relationships. The erosion is subtle. It's hidden beneath years of habits and routines. Small shifts accumulate quietly, like dust in corners no one thinks to check. Until one day, What was once gentle now feels harsh. What used to be playful becomes pointed. What was forgiven with a smile now becomes remembered with resentment. The years stack up, not just in memories, but in unspoken frustrations. Things we meant to say but never did, hurts we brushed aside, assuming they'd fade. But they didn't. They buried themselves in the language of everyday life. And, over time, resentment doesn't always shout. Sometimes it slips in wearing politeness. Sometimes it hides in casual indifference. Other times, it wears sarcasm or small corrections. A tone too sharp, a smile too thin. A comment dressed as a joke, but spoken to diminish. That's how emotional distance grows, not through loud fights, but through the words we pretend mean nothing. Through sighs, silences, and glances that look past rather than toward. And David, in his quiet way, absorbed it all. He thought love meant letting things go. He believed that silence was strength, that avoiding arguments was a form of protection. But slowly, something inside him began to ache. Not from the words themselves, but from what they suggested. He started to feel smaller in his own home, like a man quietly shrinking in the very life he had built. Like a guest lingering too long at a table where the host no longer looks him in the eye. And then it hit him. Margaret no longer saw him as her partner. She had begun to see him as an inconvenience, not because she ever said it outright, but because it was etched into the silence. It was written in the pauses between her replies. It lived in the way she looked through him during dinner, eyes fixed on something far away. There's a psychological truth that's hard for anyone, especially couples who've shared decades, to admit. When love begins to sour, it doesn't always turn bitter. Sometimes it turns silent. It becomes a quiet withdrawal, a daily judgment unspoken but always felt. Margaret didn't wake up one morning and choose to be cold. Her withdrawal wasn't fueled by cruelty, but likely by her own quiet pain. Her dissatisfaction had gone unspoken for so long that it turned inward, and then outward, in the form of detachment. Needs unmet, emotions buried, disappointments never voiced. Over time, those things change a person. They harden softness. They turn effort into habit and affection into routine. Instead of turning toward David, she had begun turning away, slowly, gracefully, protectively, as if guarding her own heart from further invisibility. The Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "It is not the things themselves that disturb us, but the interpretations we place upon them." And for a long time, David held on to that thought like an anchor. But what happens when those interpretations begin to echo louder than the truth itself? In the next part, we'll look at the third and final sign, the one that reveals when love is no longer just drifting, but retreating. When love's language begins to lose its warmth, what remains often speaks louder than words. David kept reminding himself not to take her tone too personally. Maybe Margaret's sighs and sharp comments weren't about him at all. Maybe they came from somewhere deeper inside her, from fatigue, unspoken disappointment, or simply the erosion of time. And to some extent, that was true. But Stoicism doesn't just teach us to soothe our hearts. It urges us to see clearly, to stop romanticizing the storm, and to step into it with open eyes. And the truth? The hard, bare truth? Her words had changed. They were no longer shaped by love. They had become something else. Not harsh enough to call cruelty, but cold enough to feel like quiet rejection. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniably painful. Because when someone begins to lose emotional investment in you, it rarely starts with distance or departure. It often starts with how they speak. Not in what they say, but in what they stop saying with care. The gentleness disappears first. The effort fades. The little moments, where feedback was once offered with kindness and concern, become blunt, transactional, or indifferent. Stoicism teaches us not to flinch from this, not to wallow in sorrow or fight for fantasy. Instead, it calls for clarity, for presence, for measured action, not confrontation, but recognition. David realized something he hadn't let himself face before. He couldn't change Margaret's tone. He couldn't rewind time to fix the missteps, the misunderstandings, or the silent scars that had built up in her heart. But he could still change something important, the way he showed up. He didn't need to beg for softness. He didn't need to earn her attention back through pleasing or apologizing for simply existing. He could reclaim something far more powerful than approval: his dignity. Not through pride or ego or coldness, but through presence, through stillness, through choosing to be fully himself, even when he wasn't being seen clearly. And for so many in later adulthood, this is a brutal truth to face. That decades together, sharing a home, a bed, a life, don't guarantee emotional closeness. Time alone is not a proof of love's survival. Sometimes, it only stretches the slow timeline of disconnection. Thank you for staying with Live Stoic, Live Strong. It means you're seeking more than words. We're here for that journey with you. But if we are awake, if we stop pretending, then something can still be salvaged. Maybe not the version of the relationship that once was. Maybe not the spark we once knew. But what can be saved is self-respect. And from that, a quieter kind of peace. David didn't lash out. He didn't make demands. But one day, he began to meet Margaret's eyes again. Not in confrontation, but with quiet courage. He started speaking honestly. Not with blame, but with truth. He began expressing what he felt. Not asking for validation, just refusing to remain invisible. And in doing so, something remarkable happened. He stopped shrinking. He stopped twisting himself to fit into the silence. He started existing again. Not as a man waiting for kindness, but as someone rediscovering his own voice, even if no one else was listening. Because sometimes, the most painful thing about growing old together isn't the arguments or even the loneliness. It's the realization that you've drifted so far apart, yet you're still sitting at the same table, passing the salt as though everything is fine. But, and this matters, if you're willing to see it, to stop pretending not to notice, then it's still possible to turn toward each other again. Or, at the very least, to turn toward yourself. And that too is a kind of love worth honoring. In the next and final part of this story, we'll look at what it really means to stay awake inside a relationship, and how healing doesn't always mean restoring what was, but embracing what is. Sometimes, love doesn't vanish. It just stops showing up in the way we speak to each other. In the last part, we explored how the warmth in Margaret's voice had cooled. How her words, once soft and teasing, had slowly become distant. David could feel the change, not from a single moment, but from 1,000 tiny ones, stitched quietly into their days. There was a time when the jokes between them were light, loving, and full of familiarity. The kind of teasing only two people who've spent a lifetime together could share. The kind that made you feel safe even in your flaws. It was never about the cooking. It was about the closeness. About being able to laugh at each other without fear. and still reach for one another's hand across the table. But slowly, subtly, that changed. The jokes lost their sparkle. The smile that once softened Margaret's face no longer reached her eyes. She still commented on David's cooking, but her tone had sharpened. She began pointing out how he left ingredients out on the counter, how he misplaced utensils, how he stirred too quickly or seasoned too little. At first, these were just small remarks, the kind that pass quietly in a calm evening. But over time, the tone shifted. The teasing no longer felt playful. It began to feel like criticism dressed in routine. And the criticism? It no longer felt like love. David noticed it wasn't just happening in the kitchen anymore. She started commenting on how he left his shoes by the front door. Like a child, she'd mutter. She corrected him mid-conversation as though she couldn't trust him to finish a sentence without slipping. She'd sigh when he made a suggestion, her breath heavy with silent disapproval, as if she had already decided it wouldn't be right. And still, David didn't push back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't meet her sarcasm with anger. He thought, maybe she's just tired. Maybe it's stress. Maybe this will pass. He didn't want to stir up conflict in a house that had once been built on peace. But beneath his quiet understanding, something began to shift. Not just in Margaret, but in him too. What had once felt like an equal exchange between partners now felt like subtle judgment. Margaret wasn't shouting, she wasn't cruel, but her voice, now measured and cool, carried a weight it hadn't before. Her words were no longer delivered with warmth or curiosity. They weren't filled with bitterness, but neither were they anchored in love, and that absence, that hollow space where affection used to live, was what hurt the most. For many couples in the later stages of life, this transformation is so slow, so buried under years of shared routine, that it becomes nearly invisible. Until suddenly, it's not. The decades bring with them unspoken frustrations, disappointments swept under the rug, emotions never quite processed. And then, what once was charming becomes annoying. What once was forgiven without thought now becomes fuel in a quiet, smoldering fire. Resentment doesn't always walk in wearing anger. Sometimes it wears politeness. Sometimes it tiptoes in as sarcasm. Other times it slips quietly into the background, disguised as indifference. A nod instead of a reply, a glance instead of connection. Emotional distance doesn't always show up with drama. It shows up in the words we pretend don't mean anything until they do. David, in his quiet way, absorbed it all. He told himself he was being loving, that letting things slide was the kind thing to do, that peace was worth more than pride. But something inside him started to ache, not from the harshness of Margaret's words, but from what they didn't say, from the way they made him feel smaller, less seen, less held. He began to feel like a stranger in his own home, like a man overstaying his welcome at the dinner table he had helped build. And in that stillness he realized something piercing and painful. Margaret no longer looked at him as her partner. She looked through him, past him, around him, but not to him. And in the next part, we'll explore what happens when one person stops reaching and the other must decide whether to stay invisible or finally step back into the light. When someone stops looking at you, really seeing you, love doesn't always disappear, but it does begin to dim. Margaret hadn't told David that he was a burden. She didn't need to. It was already there, written between her pauses, layered beneath her sighs, hidden in the way her eyes moved past him instead of toward him. During dinner, during conversations, even during moments of stillness, her attention had become a shadow of what it once was. And in that silence, David discovered something most people never want to admit. Love doesn't always end with a fight. Sometimes it slips away quietly, like the sun at the end of a long day, fading slowly until one moment you notice it's gone. For David, this wasn't just painful, it was illuminating. And it was Stoic philosophy that helped him name this feeling, not so he could run from it, but so he could stand face to face with it, with courage, with clarity. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." And that night, lying awake in the dark, David didn't fight what he felt. He didn't reach for reassurance, didn't rehearse imaginary conversations to win her back. He simply let the truth settle. Yes, it hurt, but it was real. And there's a strange kind of power that comes from no longer pretending. Stoicism doesn't ask us to bury emotion or build walls around our hearts. It teaches us to observe, to examine, to understand our own reactions, especially when life doesn't meet our hopes or our history. David saw it clearly now. He had been holding too tightly to the idea of their marriage, the memory of what it had been, the highlight reel of years gone by. But in doing so, he had blinded himself to the growing emptiness between them, the emotional vacancy that routine had quietly carved out. And yet, this is not a story of despair, it's a story of awakening. Because when you finally see what a relationship has become, without filters, without fantasy, you're no longer trapped. You are free. Free to respond not with bitterness but with intention. David didn't leave. Margaret didn't suddenly soften. But something in him began to change. He stopped waiting for scraps of affection to make him feel whole again. He no longer needed a look, a word, or a gesture to prove his worth. Instead, he began to live differently inside the truth. With presence, with quiet dignity, he started showing up, not to fix her, not to win her back, but to find himself again. He paid attention to small moments, moments that asked nothing of her. A walk alone, a deep breath by the window, a journal left open on the table. And in those quiet pauses, where her gaze no longer landed, he began to see himself more clearly. This is one of life's hardest lessons, especially for those who love deeply and give fully. The absence of love isn't always a failure. Sometimes it's simply a shift in conditions. People change, hearts grow weary, expectations evolve, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is sit with the silence, not dramatize it, not deny it, and ask ourselves, who am I now in this new space? That night in the dark, for David, wasn't an ending. It was the start of something quieter, deeper. Not a new romance, not a return to what was, but a homecoming to himself, to his stillness, to his worth. He could now say, without shame or sorrow, "This is what is, and I will meet it with dignity," because when love withdraws, it doesn't always mean the story is over, but it does mean the story is changed. And the only question left is, how will you live inside that change? Because love, real love, was never meant to be a habit. It is a choice, one that must be made over and over again, especially in the quiet years, when routine takes the place of romance and affection starts wearing the mask of obligation. In the final part, we'll explore how to reclaim love, not just with another, but within ourselves, even when the silence has been growing for years. When silence grows long in a relationship, love doesn't always end, but it does ask you to choose how you'll show up within it. The Stoics never taught us to cling to what's slipping through our fingers. They never encouraged blind endurance for its own sake. Their wisdom wasn't about holding on. It was about seeing clearly, accepting reality as it is, and then responding, Not from fear, not from emotion, but from a place of grounded clarity. David came to understand this in what felt like the final season of his marriage, when the silence between him and Margaret had become not just common, but constant. It stretched between them like fog, dense, quiet, and hard to breathe through. He stopped blaming her, and in time, he stopped blaming himself. Because what he began to see was far more honest, and far more human. Love doesn't die from a single betrayal, or an argument shouted across a room. It doesn't crumble in one explosive moment. Most of the time, it fades when two people stop choosing each other, when kindness becomes conditional, when affection becomes mechanical, when a kiss on the forehead, once sacred, becomes a habit instead of a gesture. David realized something heartbreaking and honest. The absence of love doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from forgetfulness, from routine, from the slow erosion of why you ever began. And in that quiet knowing, he didn't rush to fix anything. He didn't demand answers. He didn't perform pain. Instead, one evening, with no drama, no big decision looming, he sat down with a pen and paper and wrote a letter. Not to ask her to come back to him. Not to convince her of anything. But to remember. To remember what was true. To say, simply, sincerely, I still see you. I still remember who we were. And if any part of you still wants to be seen, I'm here. That was his stoic response to heartbreak. Not withdrawal, not bitterness, but presence. To remain rooted even when the winds of distance blow. To choose dignity over desperation. To offer love, not to rescue the past, but to stay aligned with who he wanted to be. David wasn't hoping for a grand turnaround. He didn't script a fairy tale ending. But by acting from awareness, not fear, he reclaimed his place in the story. Not as a victim of love fading, but as a man who still chose to love with integrity, even when it was no longer easy. And maybe that's what real love becomes. Not fireworks, not perfection, but willingness. A quiet strength that whispers, I won't chase what's left, but I'll stand still with open arms in case it chooses to return. Because in every long relationship, this moment eventually arrives. One day, you'll feel the shift. You'll hear the silence. You'll notice how their words sound soft but land sharp. How their presence remains, but their soul feels elsewhere. And when that happens, you face a choice. You can chase a shadow, holding tightly to the habits, the roles, the life you built. Or you can turn inward. You can come home to yourself. You can hold yourself with clarity, with compassion, with the quiet strength of someone who knows, I am still whole, even when someone forgets to choose me. Because Stoic philosophy never tells us to beg. It never tells us to blame. It tells us to see, to accept, and then to act. Not out of fear, but from wisdom, from love, from self-respect. So if you're here right now, if you've felt this ache in your chest, this quiet unraveling, know this: you are not alone, and you are not powerless. Whether you choose to stay or to walk away, do it with your eyes open, your heart honest, and your self-worth intact. In the final reflection, we'll explore what it truly means to close one chapter, not in defeat, but in peace, and how sometimes letting go is the most loving thing we can do. Thank you for your time. If one idea touched you today, come back next time. It may reach deeper. Share this with someone who needs a quiet moment. See you in the next video.